It started, recording started. You can go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So, good evening, everyone. Joining from India, and good morning to the speaker, joining all the way from the United States of America. Welcome to Radio Sophia, one of the exclusive platforms to discuss and debate on varied disciplines of economics, management, and other social sciences. A couple of weeks back, we heard on Radio Sophia how a statistician borrowed machine learning to do economics. Today, we shall hear how an economist borrows machine learning to do statistics. All has been possible because data has multiplied, crises have got added, time has reduced, and attention in economics has got divided. The benefits of this divided attention has been that economists like Suzanne Athey now study consumer choices of lunch menus in restaurants using cell phone mobile location data from customers to devise firm strategies using machine learning. In these pandemic times, when both choices and lunch menus have been slightly restricted, we at Radio Sophia decided to seek tutelage from Ms. Shilpi Mukherjee to understand the new flavor of machine learning in economics. Our speaker for today, Ms. Shilpi Mukherjee, completed her BSc in economics from the Presidency College, Kolkata, and her master's and MPhil in economics from the Calcutta University. Currently, she is a PhD student at Clemson University in US. Her PhD dissertation revolves around understanding political polarization through social media channels in India and US, as well as on information disorder in India. Recently, she was one among the 373 young economists from the 60 countries who were invited to the 7th Lindo meeting on economic sciences, which happens to be a prestigious meeting of Nobel laureates. We are indeed happy to host her for a talk on Radio Sophia and gather insights on the application of ML in economics. Shilpi, thank you for accepting our invite, and now the stage is all set for some machine learning.
Over to you, Shilpi. Thank you so much, Madhuri, for that gracious introduction. I'm really happy to be here. So I just want, my sharing screen option is not open, so if you could just look into that.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much. So I'll be talking about machine learning and economics, and I get that a lot of, so you guys can see my screen, right?
Yes. Yeah, it's visible. It's absolutely visible.
Right. So a lot of us are well acquainted with economics and a fair bit about it, but the topic that I was giving today, and when Himadri told me about giving a talk on machine learning and economics, and then I started preparing the slides, I realized that there were a couple of things that I needed to talk about. So the interest I get is more about on this conjunction of machine learning and economics, but to make you understand what is the conjunction between machine learning and economics, it's important to talk about machine learning a little bit. So I'll be starting from the very basic and explaining what machine learning really is. So if some of you are really seasoned experts in machine learning, probably this talk is going to be too dumb for you, but you know, I took the risk of boring my audience rather than losing them out completely. So I'll be walking you through the basics of machine learning and then sort of talking at a very high level about how machine learning and economics connect. So let's start. So before I begin, before I go into the journey, a little bit about myself. So my research interests lie in computational social science, behavioral economics, and game theory. I really want to understand the human decision-making process at a fundamental level. I'm interested in political polarization, information disorder, political economy, and development economics. Himadri mentioned a couple of my current working projects. Apart from the two that he mentioned, I'm also working with one of my friends, Shagnik Das from City University, New York, on political competition in India and its effects on developmental outcomes. A couple of papers on the role of information in the strength of opinions. And I am also working on the school project of understanding how biases are formed by doing a brain imaging. I'm also working on a theoretical paper with Professor Shukanta Bhattacharya and Professor Anirban Mukherjee from Calcutta University on the incentive mechanism behind writing online reviews. So that's a little bit about myself, but let's delve into the journey right now. So machine learning, what is machine learning? Now I get the sense that a lot of people think that machine learning and artificial intelligence are buzzwords that have been created in the last 10 to 15 years. But machine learning, the term machine learning really goes back to 1959 when Arthur Samuel first coined it. And what it really means is you allow the machine to learn for themselves how to perform a task. And in the context of economics and empirical economics more so, what it means is you allow the machine to uncover the patterns in the data. And that is what is the main crux of machine learning that we are going to talk about today. And we are going to see how machine learning, instead of us hard coding these equations into the system, it will by itself learn the patterns in the data. But before we again go into more of the meat, there are two perspectives of machine learning. One comes from the statistics side of the domain and the other from the computer science. So I was watching this cool slide where there was this equation, y is equal to beta x plus epsilon, and it was statistics, and then there was this 10-year challenge and it became machine learning. So there is this idea among statistics that machine learning is nothing but just a fancy new way of doing statistics. But I don't quite agree with that. So in statistics, what we assume is there is this underlying data generating process and there are probabilistic models. And for example, if you consider the Mincer equation in economics, which says that, wages are related to your schooling, to your experience, and your experience squared, right? And everything else is in the error term, and these are not at all correlated with either schooling or experience. And there has been a lot of work in the last 10 to 15 years in early childhood intervention, which shows that, your innate ability and what happens during your early childhood can affect your schooling outcomes very drastically, and that can affect your wage structure. So, it's not very difficult to see that the assumptions that we make in economics, even for models that we have been estimating again and again and again, the Mincer equation is a very famous equation. The data generating process that we assume, which is at the back of our model, is not quite true, and it's very easy to dispute that. So the data generating process that we use in machine learning is basically an approximation or a simplification of actually what is going on in the real world. And what machine learning does it allows us to, circumvent this problem, and we do not have to rely on approximation anymore. So that's one view of machine learning. The other comes from the computer science background, where computer scientists earlier had to hard code all decisions that machines needed to take through a if and else statement. And now they can just give the machine a task, and the machine can, decide what actions to take by itself. So these two perspectives of machine learning, we have an object, are pretty much aware of in economics. But the implication is you have this one objective function that the machine needs to optimize, and it can figure out its own way of optimizing that objective function. And generally the objective function which is used in machine learning is a loss function, and we try to minimize that function. So before going into the technical details, a couple of success stories on why machine learning has become so popular. So I'm sure most of you know about this, but for some of you who don't, so AlphaGo was an algorithm developed by Google DeepMind, and it bet Lee Sedol, who was the world champion in Go, for more than one time. So it actually bet Lee Sedol for 4 times. And AlphaGo, or the game of Go, is considered to be a much more complicated game than chess, because the possible moves in Go is very large compared to the moves in chess. And this AlphaGo was trained using something called reinforcement learning, and it was a huge breakthrough for the entire machine learning community as well as the artificial intelligence community. The picture that you can see on your right is the Netflix recommendation challenge hosted on Kaggle way back in 2009, and these people got a $1 million prize in 2009 for coming up with a machine learning algorithm that predicted what movies Netflix should show in their website. Unfortunately, Netflix never implemented this model because they thought that this model was too complicated for the software engineers to actually write down in code. But this just goes on to show that machine learning has really taken the world by surprise, and we are doing a lot of things that wouldn't have been possible 10 or 20 years back had it not been for machine learning. But when we talk about success stories, it's equally important to talk a little bit about failures. And the reason I do this is to make sure at the beginning that we understand that machine learning or even artificial intelligence is just a tool, and the power of it, as in the great movie they said, with great power comes great responsibility. So if you're yielding that great power of machine learning, you have to make sure that you're asking the right questions and you're ensuring that your model is doing the correct thing. So these are two examples. The one on your left is about a secret AI recruiting tool that Amazon used to recruit employees. And they found that after some years, they found that this recruiting tool was systematically discriminating against women. And the interesting part about this was when they trained the model, they did not explicitly mention whether the candidate was a female or a male. So that information on the gender of the candidate was nowhere there in the model. Even despite that, this AI recruiting tool was discriminating against women. And the reason they said was, if in your resume you had something like you were a part of a group called Women Who Code, or you were in some sorority club, then the AI tool took that as a hint that you're a woman and discriminated against you. The second figure here is an article which was published in Nature, and it has got a lot of citations. There's 2,000 citations. And this article was basically about Google using their web search data to trump the CDC, which is the Center for Disease Control in US. And just by using their web search data, they could predict 2 years prior to the CDC when a particular flu epidemic is going to happen in US. And this garnered a lot of attention back in 2008. And this was considered to be a huge win for machine learning. But then in 2013, when actually a very big flu epidemic hit US, this Google Flu Trends, it underestimated the prediction by 140%. And the reason that was given is that between 2009 and 2013, Google introduced the auto-completion feature in their search engine, and they did not update their model accordingly, and the model failed disastrously. And in 2013, they just scrapped this model of detecting influenza epidemics. So the reason I show you is because of this, that there has always been fads in economics, and as you can see, from about, so this is 2005, 2010, so around 2006, machine learning or big data has been used a lot in NBR working papers. And I'm not saying that's wrong or that's, there's something bad about it, but what I'm just trying to say, because we all are doctoral candidates, or most of us are, is that when we are thinking about using these techniques, we need to make sure that these are just tools to answer a particular question, and we need to select the right question and ensure that the tools fits our purpose of answering the question. So that's something that we should always keep in mind before we go into this zoom of machine learning and economics. So now that I've given you a brief overview of machine learning, let's come to what machine learning is. And there are broadly two types of machine learning. There is a fringe type of machine learning called reinforcement learning, which is mostly used in the engineering domain and self-driving cars. But the machine learning that's really used in economics and also for most practical purposes can be classified into supervised and unsupervised. And what supervised machine learning means is, there are these independent observations, and by independent I mean that they are statistically independently distributed. And you have both the dependent variable and the independent variable in your data. So you have an outcome variable, you have the Y variable, and then you have a bunch of covariates or features as they are known in the machine learning lingo. And you do two things. You either perform a regression task, so you find out the expectation of Y given X, or you do a classification task and you find out the probability that Y belongs to a particular class given X. Okay, and this is something that we have been doing in economics for quite some time. So, our standard simple linear regression model or multiple linear regression model is a regression task, and a logit and probit is a classification task. So this is not really something new to us in terms of the underlying concept of what is being done, But the tools that machine learning use or the algorithms that machine learning use is something that we haven't used so much in economics. The other kind of machine learning is something called unsupervised machine learning. And the interesting thing here is that there are no independent variables. So there is no outcome. There is no outcome variable. Sorry, it should be there are no dependent variables. So there is no dependent variable, there is no outcome variable. You just have a bunch of covariates or a bunch of features. And what you want to do through this type of machine learning algorithm is you want to group similar kinds of entities together based on different metrics. And the most commonly used metric is a distance metric. So you basically calculate the Euclidean distance in a two-dimensional setup or in a high-dimensional setup, and you group which entities are close together and which entities are farther apart. So this technique has been used a lot in grouping images, it grows in grouping cells, and by cells I mean our human body cells, grouping text data or documents, as well as music. So you can look at a music data and you can say, okay, this group of music is pop music, this is Sufi music, this is Hindustani classical music, and all that can be done through unsupervised learning. A little more about supervised learning and the classification problems, and you have a really cute cat and dog image here, and that's not by accident. So the reason I show this cat and dog image is because this is a canonical example which is used in the computer science domain to test their classification algorithms. So they have this data set of cats and dogs, which they believe is, which is accepted throughout the community, and then everybody comes up with their own algorithms. And if they can perform better in this cat and dog algorithm, then they consider that their algorithm is, better than the algorithms that have already come in. And supervised classification has had huge advances in image classification, computer vision, autonomous driving, and so on and so forth. For purposes of economics, we have been doing this thing for quite some time in a Logitop-Probit framework. But again, we were not used to the algorithms such as decision trees, random forest classifier, and neural networks. Okay, so these new algorithms give us greater flexibility in sort of classifying different classes. And we will see in a couple of slides more that what kind of flexibility or what kind of superiority in performance I'm talking about that we get from these algorithms that we could not have got from our age-old logistic regression or Probit regression. The second type is the supervised learning regression algorithm. Again, this is a canonical example where you estimate house prices on the basis of all the information that you can get on the house. So the number of rooms, the crime rate, what is the space of the parking garage, whether you have a kitchen sink or not. So all the different kind of variables that you have for your house, you can just throw them in your algorithm and then you will predict the house price. And the algorithms here used here are age-old OLS, but also stuff like Ridge, Lasso, Random Forest Regressor, and Elastic Mill. Unsupervised learning. So what unsupervised learning does is, as I said, it performs either clustering, and we have a bunch of algorithms like k-means clustering, hierarchical Bayesian modeling, as well as LDA, latent dirichlet allocation, for clustering purposes. And we have dimensionality reduction, which is mostly used in the biostatistics literature. So you have a cell and you have 1,000 or more than 1,000 gene expressions for that cell, and that's a large number of covariates. So you want to reduce all that information to the first, let's say, 7 principal components. And that's why principal components is very useful for dimensionality reduction. That falls under the purview of unsupervised learning, but we have been doing it for quite some time in economics. There is something else called independent component analysis, which is also an algorithm of dimensionality reduction. This figure that I have on the left is something from my own work, and this illustrates this concept of unsupervised learning, specifically of using the LDA model using text data. So what this figure basically shows is I have all the tweets made by Democrat politicians from the month between November to December 2018, and I just collect all the tweets and I run an LDA model on that with 10 number of topics. Okay, and what this LDA model does basically is that it finds out which words co-occur frequently together, and then it divides those words into 10 buckets or 10 bins. and it gives you the words which were used in each of these buckets. So right now the figure that I'm showing you is the top 30 most relevant terms for topic 1, which is 23.5% of all your words. So tokens is basically another fancy name for words in natural language processing, which is again a fancy name for using machine learning in text data. So as you can see that most of the words that we get here, if you can see this figure all right, are words like tax, GOP tax scam, American, middle class, corruption, Republican, deduction, taxes, million, benefit, GOP tax bill, debt, and so on and so forth. And through the words, you can realize that this topic itself is talking about taxation. And what is more interesting is that because they are Democrats, they are talking about GOP tax scam, and GOP basically refers to Republicans in America. And we know that America has a bi-party system where there are only Republicans and Democrats. So they are talking about something called GOP tax scam. We know, or at least since I have been staying in America, I know that Democrats are more concerned about the middle class. So we have middle class here, we have GOP tax bill, and so on and so forth. So this is a very cool way of analyzing text data. This is something that I have extensively used in my work, and a lot of other people, including Professor Jensko from Stanford University. He has used LD in a lot of his works and has done some amazing research on text data. And this is also very common. It's relatively not so common in economics. I know Professor Jensko, who does this, a little bit of this is done by Shapiro and Matt Taddy, but this is very common in the political science literature while analyzing large volumes of text data. And it's steadily and slowly making inroads into economics as well. So now that we have covered the different types of machine learning algorithms that are out there and talked a little bit about what kind of algorithms are there in each subset of in each of these parts of machine learning, let's answer the big question that what's the big deal about ML. Okay, so I told you that when we are talking about supervised machine learning, we have this regression task and we have the classification task. And we have, as economists, we have been doing that for a long time. We have been running instrumental variable regression and difference and difference and RDD and simple linear regression, MLM, for a very long time, and so as well as that for logit and probit regression, right? So what is it that we have been missing that ML adds to our repertoire? Okay, and I think these two graphs or these two figures actually very succinctly show, where the power of ML comes from. So this first picture on the left is a picture which was shared by Matt Taddy. He is now a senior VP at Amazon. Earlier, he was a professor of statistics at University of Chicago. And the red dots here are basically an actual scatter plot of Clippy, which is a tool that we all have used in Microsoft Word, which has a very weird shape. And this red dots here are the simulation of data which actually mirror that Clippy image. And then the blue dots here, or the blue line here, is the fitted curve over these red dots using a machine learning algorithm. And what jumps out of this picture right away is we could have never, maybe in 1,000 years, come up with an equation that, that fits this kind of a complex shape using our traditional econometric method. So it's very difficult to come up with a polynomial equation that will exactly mirror this image of Clippy here. But machine learning, because they have been given a task and they are not, the data generating process itself is not hardwired into the decision-making process of the machine, it gives a very good fit of this Clippy image. The second figure that we have on the right is an image from McKinsey. And again, this shows how machine learning is useful. So the quarter circular curve that you see here is basically classic regression analysis using nonlinear, nonlinear classical linear regression analysis. Sorry, a nonlinear classical regression analysis. And you can see that it basically divides the zone between these two different sets. So here McKinsey is trying to identify the risk behavior, the riskiness, and what a normal nonlinear regression does is it basically separates the state, separates the entire hyperplane into two separate classes. But when you use a machine learning algorithm, you find that you come up with this wonderful heat maps where the warmer colors denote more risk and the cooler colors denote less risk. and you have this nice gradient, which is only possible using machine learning framework. So that's the big deal about ML, that we can fit really flexible, complex, and rich functions on our data set. We do not have to assume what our data generating process looks like, and we can get much more accurate predictions. So that's why it's an improvement over classical methods. The next question that I think also begs to be answered is, why is ML so popular all of a sudden? And Himadri touched on this a little bit in the introduction. ML is so popular all of a sudden, not that because these algorithms were suddenly discovered. Most of these algorithms have been there for quite some time, but because we have this huge boom in big data. And again, when we talk about big data, you know, it's a blanket term for a lot of things. But from what I understand, big data can be broken down into these 3 subparts. The first of which is wide data. So by wide data, we mean that we have more covariates than the number of observations. So think of something like a data set in Amazon or Google, where they record each click of yours, and therefore you have a large number of feature vectors, but you don't have that many observations, and that is something we cannot fit using a traditional multiple linear regression model, because it violates our degrees of freedom assumption, or degrees of freedom framework. Long data is something where you have too many rows to handle in a normal software package, and the limit for handling data is increasing day by day. But that's another form of big data. If you have, you know, terabytes or exabytes of data, that's very difficult to handle in a normal software package. Your Stata or eViews or even R and Python is going to break down unless you do some multi-threading and those kind of stuff. The third kind of big data, I think, which is actually the data that needs to be analyzed through machine learning and only machine learning, is unstructured data. So this is also a part of data, and by unstructured data we mean images, text, social media data, speeches, music, satellite data, GIS data, mobile phone data, and all these kind of things, okay? And for these kind of data, because they are not in a spreadsheet kind of format, we cannot run our age-old multiple linear regression model on them. So we first of all need to pre-process this data to bring them to a format which we can analyze using our traditional tools, or sometimes we need to, you know, use the machine learning algorithms, as I showed you, the LDA algorithm on the text data itself to come up with meaningful patterns. And I think this is one of the unstructured data is the most important data source that we as academicians can work with, because wide data is something that is more restricted to companies, so we don't have that much access to wide data, but unstructured data is something that machine learning is very useful for. And another reason why machine learning has become so popular all of a sudden is huge advances in computational technology. So all of us, or a lot of us now, have very powerful GPUs in our computer. In the West, for example, in my university, you have access to a supercomputer where you can run your regressions. So I'll tell you, for one of the regressions that I run for my paper, it takes 3 days to run on a supercomputer, and I have to run 104 such regressions. So that's simply not possible with a traditional multi-linear regression framework, and that is why machine learning is developing so fast and so quick. Okay, so now that we have talked a little bit about machine learning and the different kinds of algorithms that we use in machine learning, so what is the difference, or what is the comparison between machine learning and the state of the art or econometrics that we know? So in machine learning, the object of interest, the thing that we are really interested in, is the prediction of y. Okay, all we care about is what is the fitted value of y. So we care about y hat. In econometrics, we care about the parameter estimate beta hat. So we are trying to find causality, and all we care about is beta. The criterion through which we judge or validate a machine learning algorithm is through the optimal fit or the mean square error. So we want the mean square error, the difference between the actual value of the y and the predicted value of the y given your function and your x variables. We need that to be as small as possible in a machine learning framework. Whereas in econometrics, we really don't care about that. All we care is about unbiasedness in finite sample and consistency if we do not get unbiasedness in finite sample, but we can at least show that our estimate is consistent in limiting form. The criterion that we use to evaluate a machine learning model is empirical, so it's very data driven. We have a very objective notion of how we are going to evaluate a machine learning model, whereas in econometrics, the evaluation is very conceptual, right? So if you have ever been to an economic seminar, and most of you have, the questions that, for an empirical paper, the questions that you will mostly argue about is whether there are endogeneity issues, whether there is reverse causality, whether the functional specification form is correct, and things like this, or your identification assumption. So the questions that we mostly argue about are conceptual questions, but not, empirical or objective questions. So what do we use to validate a machine learning model? Well, we validate our machine learning model by looking at its fit on testing data. So basically we divide our model or divide our observations into a training set and a testing set. So assume that you have 1,000 observations. So you take 80% of it as a training set and you keep 20% as a testing set. And then you run your model on this 800 observations and you get a functional form for your model. And then you use that functional form to predict the Y's in the testing set. And if those Y's that you predict for the testing set are very close to the actual Y's in the testing set, then we say that, well, your model is good. Your testing mean squared error is low. But if it doesn't, then your model is bad because your testing mean squared error is high. And the reason why we care about testing mean squared error is, for the training set, we already know the Y's. So it's good if we have a functional form that can predict the Y's very well. But it doesn't matter really that much because, well, at the end of the day, we know the Y's. Okay. But what we really care about it is if we are given a data set for which we don't know the Y's, how accurately can we predict what the Y's will be given our feature vector. So we try to cross-validate our fit on the testing data. In econometrics, again, the criteria for evaluation is high-level assumptions on the data generating process. So again, things with your endogeneity, specification, and how the data is actually generated. So those are the kind of questions we ask in econometrics. The final question that we ask in machine learning is how accurate is your model? Is it predicting correctly or not? Whereas in econometrics, all we care about is causality. So again, just to reiterate, the goal in a machine learning model is to minimize the mean squared error or maximize accuracy if you have classification. So accuracy is basically the number of observations that you predict correctly divided by the total number of observations. So that's your accuracy. For regression, it's the mean squared error. And the only assumption that we require for performing a machine learning algorithm is, or a couple of assumptions, two assumptions that we require are, number one is the observations are independent. And secondly, the joint distribution of Y and X are same in the test and the training set. Okay, so we assume that the data generating process, whatever it is, no matter how complex it is the same for the test set and the training set. And I think that's relatively a very weak assumption to satisfy given the kind of assumptions we make in our, the Gauss Markov assumptions that we make, that the error is uncorrelated with X and the error has a normal distribution for making inference, for inference testing and all those things. So the assumption for machine learning is really simple, it's really weak, and it's really easy to satisfy. Okay. Now, this point about the bias variance trade-off is something which is very important and something which is unique to machine learning and is not at all there in empirical economics or econometrics. And the idea to understand this bias variance trade-off is, let me give an example. So imagine you're teaching a class and there is this one, and you give a lot of homeworks and you post the solutions for those homeworks. And there is this one student who, learns all the homework solutions that you post, and she's very good at solving the homework problems, but she doesn't read the book that much, right? So when you give a final exam, she doesn't do so well. And that's basically the trade-off between bias and variance, that if you fit your data too well on the training set, then it is going to take the idiosyncrasies or the errors or the outliers into consideration as well. And it's going to give out a functional form which will not capture the big picture so much, but it will train itself on the errors of the training data. And that's not something we want. Because remember, our ultimate goal in machine learning is predicting in a data set which we have never seen earlier. So we don't care that much about accuracy or about low MSE in the training set because we already have the Y's there. we want the training set to improve a functional form that's rich enough to have good predictions for our testing set. But we do not want the model to fit on the errors or on the idiosyncrasies of the training set. So models which are very rich have a real concern of overfitting, that you overfit on the training data set and you don't make good predictions for your testing data set. And that's best illustrated through this figure right here. So in the left panel of the figure, you can see there are actually 4 lines, and I think the blue line is not so much visible. But what we do here is there's the black line is the true data generating process that we use. So you give your computer a functional form, and that is the black line, and you add some white idiosyncratic noise, and through that you get this scatter plot of X and Y. So the points that you get is this data, is the black data generating process or the black functional form, and there are some white idiosyncratic errors added to that, okay? And then you assume that you don't know what the true population DGP is, and we try to fit a model, okay? So first we start with a simple linear regression model, which is the yellow line, and you see that in the right panel of the diagram, it has a very high, in the right panel of the diagram, the gray line is the testing mean squared error and the red line is the training mean squared error. So you see that for the yellow regression line, both the training and the testing mean squared error are very high, because this linear OLS regression line does not fit the data well at all, and therefore it has, you know, the Y's are off by a large amount, both in the testing set and the training set, okay? And we don't want that. Next, what we do is we fit a blue linear regression or a blue spline, which you can see a little bit after 70 on the x-axis. Otherwise, it just mirrors the data generating process, so it's not visible. But if you look closely at the graph after 70 on the x-axis, you will see a little bit about the blue line. And that really is the true functional form of our data generating process, right? So when we have the blue line, if you again see on the right panel, the testing mean squared error is lower and the training mean squared error is lower. So you are predicting with much more accuracy, both for the training set as well as the testing set, okay? But because we don't know what the actual true data generating process is, we are not sure if we have reached the true data generating process. So we fit a spline which has more degrees of freedom, which is more flexible, and that is that green line right here. And as you can see, that fits the data, the training data really well. So it actually, you know, sort of tracks every data point or fits the noise in the data. And therefore, again, if you look at the right-hand panel, the training MSE has reduced a lot through this green point, but the testing MSE rises again, because now what you do is you have overfitted the model, okay? So the functional form that you have fitted doesn't actually look at the true data generating process, but it fits itself on the noises in the training data set. And that's not something we want. So we need to be very vigilant that our model is not overfitting. And this is something that machine learning engineers and even economists who use machine learning algorithms in their papers pay a lot of attention to. And this is a real area of concern in machine learning, because we have a very rich functional form. It's very easy to overfit. So given these things, what are the life cycle of ML algorithms? So first we select a family of models. We increase performance and reduce overfitting. And how do we increase performance? So we use the data to select among the models by something called parameter tuning. And this entire process is called regularization using the parameters. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this in the next couple of slides. And then we reduce overfitting by using the training and test set splitting that I've already talked about. And if we have less number of observations, then we use something called cross-validation, which I will also talk about in a little bit. So since in the interest of time, I cannot talk about all the machine learning algorithms, I'll just walk you through one of the machine learning algorithms, which is very easy to understand. It's very intuitive. So let's take decision trees. And again, in the, and I think I'm missing a source here. So this diagram is from Udacity, because this is being recorded. I just wanted to let everybody know that this is not my diagram. So what we have on the left is we have grades on the y-axis and test scores on the x-axis. And we are trying to predict student admissions based on these two variables. And the red points here are people or students who have not been accepted, and the blue points here are students who have been accepted. And what the decision tree algorithm does is it tries to split the data in a way so that we will be able to predict with maximum accuracy which students will be accepted and which students will be not. So what the decision tree does first is it looks at both these dimensions of the test scores and the grades, and it said that, well, from looking at the diagram, it seems that test scores are a better predictor of identifying whether students get admitted or not. So first of all, it draws this vertical line of students who are less than 5 and greater than 5, who score less than 5 and greater than 5. And then in each of these subsamples, it again makes a cut based on the grades. And it says that, well, if your test score is less than 5, and if you have a grade less than 7, then you will be rejected. And it does the same thing for all the other categories. And we come up with this nice decision plane. And now if you give this model, if you say that, well, I have a student who has scored 6 in the test and 9 in the grades, is he or she going to get an admission? And the machine learning model looks at the decision boundary and says that yes, they are going to get an admission. Okay. And how decision tree does this is they look at something called information gain, which is basically the entropy of the parent. So in this case, if you're looking at the first branch of the decision tree, the entropy of the full sample minus the average entropy of the choice. So that is how the decision trees, they want to maximize the information gain, and that is how they split the sample. So the formula for entropy is given in the slide, but what entropy basically means is, and coming from a physics or chemistry point of view too, that entropy is lower if the groups are more homogeneous. Okay, so you can see in these 3 examples, in the top circle, there are equal number of blue and red dots. And in the first instance, we split them, but we split them in a really bad way. So for both of the childs, there are equal number of blue and red dots in each of the children. So that's not a good split, and information gain is 0. In the second case, we reach a better split, not as good. So the information gain is 0.28. And in the last case, we have a perfect split. So we split in a way so that there are only blue balls on the left circle and red balls in the right circle. And there we get an information gain of 1. And for these 3 instances, because the decision tree wants to maximize information gain, it will go for the third split rather than the first and second split. So the reason I show you this model is to tell you that decision trees are one of the models which are also very prone to overfitting, and this happens for all models. The reason for showing, I just wanted to walk you through one of the ML algorithms and see what you can do about it to correct for overfitting. So in this example, in this graph, as you can see, that we are trying to distinguish between points which are circular and points which have this crosses. And we have this one cross at a point of -2 and 1. And this, what the decision tree does it puts a red boundary around that cross. Okay, and it says that, well, if you are in this part of the coordinate space, then you are classified as red. And this functional form is replicated even in the testing set. But what basically happens is maybe this cross was just an outlier and it really didn't have much to do with the actual functional form. So we see that as we increase the tree depth, the training MSE decreases a lot, which is given by the black line. But after some time, the testing MSE increases because now you are not actually picking up the functional form, but you are training your data, training your model on the errors and the idiosyncrasies in the training data. So what is parameter tuning? In decision trees, there are 3 types of parameter tuning you can do. First of all, you have this maximum depth. So if you keep the depth to a lower level, so if you have a depth of 2 instead of depth of 4, then there is going to be less overfitting at a depth of 2 compared to a depth of 4. Now, remember again that you might get very biased estimates when you have a depth of 2 compared to a depth of 4. So there is always this trade-off between bias and variance, and this is something that you as a machine learning practitioner needs to figure out by trial and error that what is the depth that you are going to look into. And this is the thing in machine learning that takes time, tuning your parameters to ensure that the trade-off is met at the right point. Another parameter tuning that you can use is the minimum number of samples to split. So if you say that the minimum number of samples to split is 11, Then in the first circle, there will be no split because there are only 11 points in the circle. But in the second case, there are more than 11 points in the first parent circle, and therefore it will split. So again, by increasing the minimum number of splits, you can reduce overfitting. Another way to prevent overfitting is by including this term or including this parameter of minimum numbers of samples per leaf. So if you have a minimum number of samples per leaf of 1, then you are going to get really overfitted decision trees because it's going to go and track each point. But if you have minimum samples per leaf of 5, then the overfitting is going to be less. And what you actually put in those parameters is going to depend a lot on your data, on the size of your data, and what you're trying to achieve. But this just goes on to show that this is the way that you do parameter tuning or regularization in ML algorithms. So this is a table which is given in Mullainathan and Spice 2017 paper, and it basically shows the different type of regularizations that you can do for all ML algorithms. I'm not going to go through each of them because then I would have to explain all the ML algorithms, and we clearly don't have time for that. But one of the things that I would want to point out here is Lasso, which is basically a regression algorithm and quite extensively used in economics. And the regularization parameter in Lasso is basically the sum of the absolute values of all the coefficients, which means that if you are including two-way or three-way interaction terms in your models and those have high coefficients, then you are going to penalize your model more, and what the model is going to do is it's going to drop those terms. The model will try to give you as sparse output as possible and include as few coefficients as possible so that you have coefficients or you have features included in your model which are really of the utmost importance. Okay, so this was all about regularization. The second way to prevent overfitting is through cross-validation, and you perform cross-validation either if you have very low sample size where you cannot use train and test split because that's not going to give you enough data for training the model, or if you have unlimited computational power. And there are different kinds of cross-validation, but two of the more famous ones are the leave one out cross-validation, where every time you use one data point as your testing set and everything else as the training set, and you repeat it n number of times if you have n observations. And then there is the k-fold. Then there is the k-fold cross-validation, where you have a 10-fold cross-validation or a 5-fold cross-validation, and you split your data into 5 subsamples. You keep one sample for testing set and the rest for the training set. So that's also a way via which you can reduce your overfitting. So what is the contrast of machine learning with traditional econometrics? I think somebody's speaker is. Okay, so
actually, Shilpi, if you don't mind, can you mute Ms. Ankita, because the host rights are with you. I am unable to mute. Yeah, now it's fine. Now it's done. Please go ahead. Yeah.
So what is the contrast with traditional econometrics? So basically in economics, we have always focused on models where our number of observations are much larger than our number of covariates. So n is greater than p or n is greater than k, whatever we might call it. And we have assumed that our in-sample mean squared error is a good approximation for out-of-sample mean squared error. And the reason we assume this is, we assume that the model is God-given. So we have uncovered the true data generating process, as I already said, for the Mincer equation. And therefore, we do not really care so much about overfitting. Okay, so the first thing that we learn in introductory econometrics is OLS is blue, best linear unbiased estimator. And we do not want to have any bias. So overfitting is not a problem, and therefore we don't want to incur bias. Okay. Where does OLS fail? As I already said, OLS fails when the number of parameters or the number of features and the number of observations are more or less equal, or when the number of features are more than the number of observations, as in a wide data, and OLS fails there, but ML methods are generally useful. Economists also worry about causal effects, counterfactual predictions, separating correlation from causality, confidence intervals, behavioral assumptions. None of this is a problem or of any concern in machine learning. All we really care about is that accuracy or the MSE, and we do not worry about any of these factors. Also, all the problems or most of the problems in ML is solved by holding out a test set. But for economics, if your identification problem doesn't work in your training set, it will not work in your testing set as well. Okay, so these are some of the areas, these are some of the conceptual areas where machine learning is different from traditional econometrics, and we need to keep it in our mind when we apply this in our papers. Again, the slide is from Susan Athi's slide at the AEA, where she says about what we as econometrics or empirical researchers say and what we do. So we say that, you know, we are interested in causal inference and counterfactuals, and we report our models as if we ran this one specification term, and you know, we got our confidence intervals and we got our estimated causal effects and standard errors from there, and then we report 4 or 5 more specification like results for robustness checks. But behind the scene, what we really do is we run a lot of functional forms. We know that the functional form is not God given, and we kind of don't report all our results. And she argues that with the coming of ML, the subjectivity in reporting of results will reduce a lot, and there will be more data-driven specification forms, and that will actually be in the interest of economics, because you know, we will not have a lot of specification forms that are being run by a RA or run by you as a PhD student, and you just report the ones which make sense. Okay. So what are the key lessons for econometrics? And this is where I sort of merge the discipline of ML and econometrics or economics a little bit. So the key lessons for econometrics is that many problems can be decomposed into predictive and causal paths. So we econometricians or empirical researchers, we have been harping about causality for a very long time, but there are a lot of problems which have a separate predictive part to it and a separate causal part to it, and it makes sense for us to handle the predictive parts using ML and then use our traditional econometrics knowledge to handle the causal parts. Okay, and we can indulge in data-driven model selection and also ML-inspired approaches for robustness. So instead of you asking your, like for professors, asking your RA to run a bunch of regressions, or as a PhD student, spending a lot of time trying different specification forms, we can automate the entire process and we can get more robust answers which are inspired by ML. So now that, I mean, Susan Athi says that we can use off-the-shelf machine learning algorithms for a lot of predictive part, it makes sense to ask the question that how does off-the-shelf ML models compare to OLS? And this is again a model which was used to predict house values. So as I said, this prediction of house values is a canonical example in regression models. And this is done by Mullainathan and Spies. And as you can see that for ordinary least squares, we get a prediction performance of 47.3% in the training sample. In the holdout sample, we get a training performance for R square of 41.7%. But when we look at something like random forest or ensemble, which is basically a combination of various regression algorithms, we see that it performs much better compared to the ordinary least squares in the training sample and as well as in the testing sample. Okay, and he also gives the relative improvement over OLS by each quantile. So if you are interested, you can look at this paper. But what this really tells us is that off-the-shelf ML models do actually perform better than OLS if they are used for prediction purposes. But what do we not learn from ML even when you're using this off-the-shelf algorithms is something again which is very important. So this is again a prediction of the housing price, and this is again from Mullainathan and Spies paper, and they use a lasso regression. And as I said, in lasso, what it does is it removes the features which are not of interest or which are not predicting the housing price that much. And what this graph shows you is basically for each of these regressions, so he runs 10 folds of the sample, and on the y-axis you have parameters in the linear model, and if that is black, it means that that parameter was included in the linear model, and if it is white, it means that the parameter was dropped down from the linear model in the lasso regression. And what really comes out from this picture is, even though the R square or the predictive performance of the lasso was good in all of these samples, there were some parameters were included in one of the samples. So for example, in the first fold of the samples, some parameters are included, which are not included in the fifth fold of the sample. So we cannot use the predictions or the features in which have been used for prediction to inform which features are important actually in a causal way. Okay, so for example, if you are predicting house values, it is possible that in one fold of the sample, your kitchen space plays a very large importance. In another fold of the sample, your parking space plays a very high importance, and kitchen space drops out. Okay, and that doesn't really mean that kitchen space or parking space has a causal effect. It basically means that both kitchen space and parking space are very highly correlated, and therefore what you really care about from a causal perspective is how big the house is. Okay, and so what we really should not do, and some papers do this, is run an ML model, look at which coefficients have been there in the ML model, and just pick them out and say that, okay, so these are the causal factors that are important. We always have to remember that in ML, our objective interest is predictive performance, whereas in econometrics, our objective interest is causality, so we cannot use one for the other. Okay. I think I am short on time, so I'll try to go a little fast for the next 10 slides. So what is the applications of machine learning in prediction? And this is also something that you will find in the Mullainathan and Spice paper. And there are different ways to articulate what are the applications of machine learning in economics, and you can sort of subsample it via the subdiscipline in which they are used. So what kind of ML algorithms are used in health, vis-a-vis politics, vis-a-vis gender economics, vis-a-vis trade. But I chose to take a different route. So here we are talking about ML algorithms that help us predict, and the route that I have taken to inform you what kind of works have been done is through the mechanism of which whether they are using new data or whether they are using a new instrumental variable approach. So the approach is the way I have sort of split the work that have been done, and not based on the subdisciplines. So one of the ways machine learning has been applied in economics and a lot of other fields is just because new data has come up. So there have been satellite image data and mobile phone data, which have been, for the first bullet point, satellite image data has been used to predict maize yield variation in Western Kenya. John et al. Have used neural net to predict local outcomes from satellite data in 5 African countries. And this is very important because these are countries where you do not have regular censuses. So you do not get very good low-level estimates for what's the poverty like or what's the socioeconomic outcome. And if you can predict this using machine learning, that goes a long way in solving some of the developmental problems. And this is not only restricted to less developed countries or developing countries, but images from Google Street View have also been used to measure block level income in New York City and Boston. Genso et al. Uses location data from a large sample of smartphones to show that during the COVID-19 pandemic, and this paper came out in July 2020 basically, so it shows that during the COVID-19 pandemic, Republicans engage in less social distancing compared to Democrats. And this is a big thing in US if anybody is following the politics of US. And he shows that using smartphone data. So, and this last paper, they use mobile phone data to predict credit card payment, and they actually do it better than some of the credit information bureaus. So that's really off-the-shelf methods that you can use for prediction problems. Some other applications using text data. My own research has to do entirely with text data, and some of these other works where restaurant reviews on Yelp are used to predict the outcome of hygiene inspections. Congressional speeches are used to measure polarization in the Congress by Jetsko et al. And individuals can be matched to employment using their psychological profiles. So this paper by Sach et al. 2020, they use the Twitter data, social media data of individuals to categorize them into psychological profiles, and then they match them based on employment. So these are really some great works that has been done, very innovative work, and everything is based on prediction. So there's no causality here. Everything is based on prediction, and this just shows that with this booming new data, you can do a lot by just using off-the-shelf algorithms and predicting the right things. Another application of off-the-shelf ML algorithms is prediction in the first stage of IV. So if you think of your instrumental variables lesson, you will know that we have a first stage where X is regressed on Z, and then on the second stage, the predicted value of X from the first equation regressed on Y, okay? And therefore, basically the first stage, because we are using the fitted values of X in the second stage to inform beta, the first stage is essentially a prediction problem. So for example, input cost as an IV for price in estimating demand, and all the finite sample bias stories that you have read about IV in your econometrics lectures is therefore a consequence of overfitting when you think it from the perspective of ML. And all the suggestions or the solutions that have already been made by people like Chernozhukov and Angrist and Kruger, they have actually, without knowing that it was ML, they have suggested the solutions of ML. So first one is, use regularization. So use lasso regression or ridge regression. And the second one is split sample your instrumental variable approach. So use one part of the model for prediction and use another part of the model for causal analysis. And that is basically train test splitting or cross-validation. So even in IB, which is very causal, a part of it can be solved by machine learning. Another application of machine learning in economics is prediction for policy. So predictive algorithms can help improve the judge's decision in bail decisions. This is the work by Kleinberg and also a little bit Mulainathan. Very good researchers. I love their work. You can, if you're interested in decision theory and ML, this is the place where you should go. Sheffin et al. 2016 show how machine learning can improve predictive accuracy in personal decisions or in hiring decisions. Chandler 2011, predict high-risk youth and therefore what kind of intervention policies can be used and how can they be appropriately targeted. Abelson, Vershi 2004, again use machine learning to improve poverty targeting. So these are all in the space of policy prescriptions, and they really help in targeting to whom the policy or to whom the support should go in terms of a policy prescription. The fourth application, again, this is all prediction. We are not doing any causality here, is testing theories. So the first one shows that Zimmerman and Moritz 2016, they use past returns of US firms, and they show that using machine learning algorithms, they show that these have significant power over the future stock prices, and this basically rejects the efficient market theory, which says that everything is already in equilibrium, so you can only make more money by taking riskier options. So there is nothing in the past that you can learn, or there is no improvement, or there is no earnings that you can make through arbitrage, and they basically prove that theory wrong. Okay, so this is very good. Again, Kleinberg, Lang, and Mulainathan 2017, they use machine learning algorithms as a means of constructing a benchmark for the best attainable level of prediction. And again, this is super fantastic work. So they harp on this concept of behavioral economics, and they say that when you ask people to say head-on tails or to simulate head-on tails draws from a random population, what you will see is that if they have already said 4 heads in a row, the 5th time they will definitely say tails. So in their brain, they are not actually perform a randomized experience or a random trial where every time the probability of a heads or tails is always 0.5. So you can get 20 heads in a row. But if you ask a human to actually simulate a binomial or a Bernoulli distribution, he or she will say maybe 4 heads, 5 heads, and then they will put in a tail. And there are a lot of behavioral models which predict why this happens. So there is the LSTM model. And these people have used machine learning to show that such behavioral theories which explain why people behave like this have about 15% predictive power and not more than that. And obviously I cannot walk you through the entire methodology of the paper, but this is some really wonderful work that has been done by them. And again, in the space of prediction and not causality at all. So what about causality? Well, we cannot use off-the-shelf algorithms for causality because they do not have confidence intervals, they are not unbiased, they do not have the same objective function as an economics model. However, there is a lot of recent work in uncovering causal effects through ML, and Athe, Imbens, Chernozhukov, and others, they have made some very notable and remarkable contributions. And this is a very technical technical part of how to use ML for causality, and in the interest of time, I could not include them today. It probably requires 2 separate lectures of, helping us understand how to uncover causality through ML. But just to let you know that some work has been done very recently. I think a couple of days back, I saw some research scientists at LinkedIn also publish a paper on how to uncover causality through ML. So if any of you are interested, you can go to those works, or we can chat later and you can email me. So what will empirical economics look like in 5 years? This is the prediction of Susan Athey. I do not have that kind of intuition or that kind of big picture idea to tell you what will happen, but she says that regularization or data-driven model selection will be the standard. Prediction models will be better appreciated. Measurement using ML techniques will be an important subfield. Textual analysis will be pretty standard, just like numerical analysis standard now, textual analysis will be pretty standard. And as I already said, a lot of examples are already out there. Models will explicitly distinguish between causal paths and predictive paths. Reduced emphasis on sampling variation, and model robustness will be emphasized in equal footing with standard error. So we will care about the R-square, we will care about the predictive accuracy a little more than we do now. And there will be models with lots of latent variables just because we have that ability to fit rich functional forms now compared to what we had a decade ago. So I think that's all for the machine learning and economics part, but this is just something that, most of us are graduate students here. And this is something that I would just like to tell you from my experience, that end-to-end life cycle of a project from data collection to analysis for a machine learning project, especially if you're working with unstructured data. So for example, my project which deals with Twitter data, I had to personally collect 2 years of Twitter data for politicians from India and US. And that entire life cycle can be a little daunting as a student without RAs or a research group. And some of the challenges that you would run into as a student is this coding challenges, which are not taught to us as a graduate student in economics. A couple of courses are being offered now, but I'm pretty sure when we were in undergrad, there were no such courses in R or Python or coding, which prepared us for this kind of job. So there needs to be a lot of self-learning. Also, when you're using these different languages such as R and Python, you would run into various problems about mitigating package issues, and something that really doesn't have to do with your research, it doesn't have to do with your ML model. These are IT problems, and if you do not have a RA, you would be the one responsible for solving this, and it might become very frustrating. It might take up a lot of your time. So what I wanted to say was feeling overwhelmed is very normal. So if you start on this journey and you take up a machine learning project, especially with unstructured data, and you feel like, this is going nowhere for some time, that's completely normal. That's what I have been feeling for like 6 months in my PhD career. And if you want any help, you can always contact me. But just to say that, this is not rocket science. If you're at it, you will get there. But there are these challenges that you will encounter, which is not really a technical challenge or a challenge that your professor will want to help you out with, because they do not have enough time most of the times, or they will not have that IT knowledge, and you have to figure things out on your own. And that's completely normal. Last, the resources available for learning machine learning is there is Darion Sanson. He is a postdoc at Vanderbilt University, and he has this one page on machine learning, and that is basically a one-stop repository for all the machine learning resources out there. Apart from that, a couple of things that have benefited me is this data science specialization from Johns Hopkins University in Coursera, applied data science with Python specialization from University of Michigan in Coursera, the machine learning nano degree from Udacity. So this is quite expensive, even from a US perspective, but they do give out offers from time to time at 50% cost, or they give out this discount. So if you get a discount, this is a good course for learning the hands-on bit of machine learning. You can always look at the scikit-learn documentation and go through them, and that helps out a lot. Another thing which, if you are looking at a paper and you want to you have some idea about that, it's always good to go into the GitHub repository of that paper. And most of the times, if these are papers by really distinguished economists, they will have the replication files, the code files, a README, and you can gain a lot of understanding about how to do the project from there. So these are some of the resources that you can use. And I think, so that's all. If you have any questions, and this is my email, so if you want to chat later, or just send me an email, and I'll be happy to talk more.
Okay, thank you so much, Shilpi, for such a lucid exposition of this usage of ML in economics. I mean, one thing after the session I realized is that, I mean, economics is often termed as a dismal science, but I have to admit, economics is one of the most accommodative sciences. I mean,
Right.
it has accommodated people not only from economics, and now it's accommodating people from statistics, computer science, and engineers, etc., etc. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's actually pretty interesting. And I'm sure after this talk, many of the researchers attending the session would gain confidence in this field and probably think over using it as a potential tool in their field of research.
Thank you.
So, yeah, so are there any questions? Wait, let me check.
Yeah, I didn't check the chat too. Maybe didn't show up. I'm sorry if anybody posted.
Yeah. So there is a question about causality. I think that was already answered during your presentation.
Okay, some a little slow. Sorry, Simran.
That's fine. That's fine. The video will be uploaded on YouTube, so she can check it. That's fine. So I think there are no more questions. I mean, most of them, fortunately, have been covered as part of your presentation. So that's pretty good. Well, I have a couple of questions for you. I mean, during the course of your presentation, you had mentioned that, I mean, while you were comparing machine learning and econometrics, you had mentioned that during machine learning, you generally kind of look at that mean squared error, and for econometrics, you basically check for the violation of the various assumptions.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, even for econometrics, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, that we do check out for mean squared error, especially in some time series analysis. I mean, we do look out for that yi minus y hat I relationship. So is it so that the econometrics is a superset and machine learning is something inside it, but econometrics is much more less accurate compared to compared to machine learning?
So I, honestly speaking, I do not know, or I do not have a lot of exposure in time series econometrics. But what the sense is that as econometricians, we do not really care about, I mean, when you are reporting a regression table, we look at the standard errors and the coefficients. We really do not care about the R square of the model. And that is because we know that you are not able to, your model is not supposed to, you know, in a sense, predict y from all the terms that can be out there, but we want to tease out the causal effect of this one variable and see if that has an effect on your output or not. So we report R squares of 6% in economics, and that probably would never be accepted in a machine learning literature. Also, in terms of whether econometrics or economics is a superset and machine learning is a subset, I mean, I would say that there is some overlap. So there is some intersection definitely, but I wouldn't say that machine learning is a subset of economics, because there are a lot of techniques in machine learning which are used for artificial intelligence and in the engineering domain also, which we haven't talked about a lot here. So it is a real field which have developed on its own. There is a lot of commonality, at least in terms of the statistics, but yeah, I don't think it's a subset of economics.
Okay. Another thing that I wanted to ask is like, I mean, what I understand is you need a lot of data for conducting experiments in machine learning. Now, for example, in the context of say macroeconomics, where most of the variables are either annual or quarterly, you hardly have, I mean, very high frequency data with macroeconomic variables. In that scenario, how do you kind of use machine learning to maybe predict some of the macroeconomic variables?
Yeah, so I think first of all, you do not require a lot of experimental data, because the entire point of doing machine learning is to use the observational data that we have available to us. For your question, so this is exactly what I do for my dissertation. So even as you said, for some of the macroeconomic indicators, we have quarterly data or yearly data. So for US, if you look at DW Nominate's course, which basically is a score which measures ideological polarization for the Congress candidates. That's reported for every house of the Congress, so every 2 years. And it's a data, therefore, which cannot be used to do very high frequency analysis. But then what I did was I found the social media data set and I used that data set to compute weekly estimates of polarization or ideological polarization. And that's not going to be exactly what is covered in the roll call votes, but you can get very close to what polarization is, and you can use these new data sets that we have to measure different things. So for macroeconomics, I know that there is this paper by somebody in Italy, in the Italy Central Bank of Italy, where they use Twitter data to find out, to compute inflation indices for every week. So because inflation indices are not available at a very high frequency, they use Twitter data and they use this textual analysis to find out what the inflation index would be. And that's really the power of machine learning, where you can exploit these new data sources to come up with estimates of things that cannot be measured so easily every week or every month. And yeah, I think that's really why machine learning is so important in economics.
So, like from a paper, I mean, from a research paper's perspective, say for example, in a traditional econometrics way, we generally first design we have a model, or we prepare a model or take it from the literature and then go for the empirical estimation, etc., etc. How is this process for a machine learning kind of a paper? So, I mean, how is it different from an econometrics paper? I mean, in terms of the design of the paper.
So if you're talking about a machine learning paper from a computer science domain, what they basically do
from the economics perspective.
From the economics perspective, it's very similar. So you would still need to have a theory of why you think this, you're performing this ML. So what the ML basically does, it fills in a gap in your empirical estimation procedure. But whatever the other part is about motivating why your research question is important and what's the theory, that still needs to be there. I mean, that's not going anywhere.
And both the techniques can be used simultaneously for the same paper.
Yes, and I think if you use both the technique, that makes a much more stronger paper than just using one technique or the other. So if you can combine ML to come up with some predictions or estimates and then use those estimates for your empirical research to guide your econometrics, traditional econometrics, I think that should be the end goal.
Right. Yeah, I hope there are no more questions. I mean, I think you've done a wonderful job in kind of explaining it throughout your presentation, and most of them have probably got answered through it. So, I mean, I would really like to thank you again for accepting the invite and, giving a splendid presentation. Wishing you all the best for your completion of PhD and your future endeavors. Also would like to thank the audience. I mean, they turned up in large numbers and sparing their time on a Sunday evening. We hope you remain associated with Radio Sophia for even more insightful sessions. Let me add in,
from Nandini, which I would just answer before you end the session. So she says that you said that the Netflix models could not be implemented due to codes which couldn't be executed. So how can we bridge the gap? So Nandini, this is something that I am not aware of, because what I meant by the fact that it could not be implemented in code is the software engineers that Netflix had, at least at that time, were not able to implement machine learning model in a production level code, and that's really more to do with software engineering than ML. So that's if you are in economics, that's not something that you need to get bogged down by. I mean, that's not really what you are doing at the end of the day. So that was Netflix's software engineers' problem, that they could not implement the code. Maybe it was too complicated to be implemented. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so any more questions? I think there are none. Yeah, so probably we can go on to end the session. So before I end the session, for the audience who are still logged in, let me kind of point out that we have a very special session next week on probably, I think it's on Saturday, 6 p.m, 29, yeah. So we have a very special session on India's health policies, to be taken by none other than Dr. Nachiket More, who is actually the ex-National Director of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and he was part of several RBI committees. So I hope you guys keep tuning in every week, either on Saturday or Sunday, and you'll get the updates through the YouTube platform as well. Till then, thank you so much, Shilpi. Bye, take care, and stay safe.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Shilpi. Bye.
Bye.